Hello everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Christine Rodriguez, and I have a podcast called AstrologyNow Podcast where I post weekly. So if you enjoy learning about Vedic sidereal astrology, please follow my podcast, AstrologyNow. It's available on all major platforms. And so I am a Vedic sidereal astrologer, and I also have a master's in social work from the University of Texas at Austin with a clinical focus. I worked as a social worker for about 3 years, mostly with refugees, asylum seekers, individuals experiencing complex PTSD. And towards the end of my social work career so far, I was working with young people who experienced abuse and neglect, a lot of really difficult circumstances. And so those were the populations that I worked with. And something that I'm really passionate about is assessing how early childhood experiences do impact individuals into their adult life. I think this is incredibly important, and I'm sure so many social workers and people who work with mental health probably agree upon. And so something that I do like to remind people about these videos is that, first of all, I am not qualified to diagnose. This video is not intended to diagnose, nor should anyone ever make decisions about their mental health or the mental health of someone else based on Vedic astrology alone. We should always be seeking the help from licensed mental health professionals, licensed health professionals, when we're making decisions or conclusions about our health or our mental well-being. So I'm really excited about this series, the social worker's assessment for various charts. Something that I love doing in Vedic astrology is looking at birth charts and figuring out how their early childhood experiences impacted them into adulthood. You may have watched my video on Marilyn Monroe. Today we are covering, finally, Logic. Logic is a rapper in the United States. I'm sure many of you know who I'm talking about. He's incredibly popular, incredibly famous, and he came from an incredibly challenging background that he sings about a lot in his songs. If you've paid attention to his music, it's not a secret that he grew up in poverty. He grew up around a lot of drug use, a lot of abuse and neglect, okay? So a lot of the conclusions that I'm making about Logic and his life are from articles I found online, and I'm coming to the conclusion of through the lyrics of his music. So Logic was born on January 22nd, 1990 as Sir Robert Bryson Hall II. And again, through his personal accounts from articles online and through his music, we know that as Logic was growing up, he was raised in an environment that lacked a lot of nourishment and lacked a lot of care. His father was absent. He did not receive a lot of healthy connection through his father. I know his father was also on drugs. And again, his father was not present for him for a lot of his life. In addition to this, his mother also struggled with substance abuse. His mother was not, it doesn't sound like a very nurturing or kind and compassionate parent. From what I was reading through his personal accounts, his mother would use biracial slurs to her own children, which I could only imagine how difficult that is on a young person's psyche. To have a mother who has relationships with people of other ethnic backgrounds and then proceeds to use racial slur to her own children, that could create a lot of issues with confusion and, again, possibly disdain towards the self or eventual self-loathing. Those early childhood experiences with our caretakers really sets the tone for how we view ourselves and how we view other intimate relationships. And so again, through this assessment, through what we know, from what we've heard through his music and through what we've heard through his personal accounts, there was a lot of neglect, not a whole lot of care, not a whole lot of individual quality time. There was absolutely substance abuse present with both of his parents, and there does seem to be a lot of verbal abuse. I haven't read anything about physical abuse. It's possible that there's physical abuse, but again, what we can know is that there was this verbal abuse, there was this neglect. And what we know about children who experience abuse and neglect, at the most extreme circumstances, children can be stunted physically, their growth can actually be stunted, and their cognitive processing can also be stunted. Sometimes kids can be 18, 19 years old and be operating as if they were mentally 12 or 13, and this is just what happens when children experience extreme abuse or extreme neglect. Fortunately, we don't see that in Logic's case. He's incredibly intelligent, which we'll get into. His mind obviously has no issues when it comes to processing quickly. But we do see these other outcomes of high-risk behavior, substance abuse, the use of substance abuse. This is also often seen with kids who experience neglect or abuse. Logic, of course, he raps about using drugs and having experiences with drugs. And it can also take a toll on one's self-worth, resulting in things like self-loathing or suicidal ideation. Logic is not shy at all about talking about his mental health. He says that he struggles with anxiety. He's struggled with depression. And so again, we can see that likely as a result from his early childhood experiences of abuse and neglect, it's resulted in these issues with anxiety and depression. And again, we're going to investigate all of this when we look at the astrology. So let's go ahead and pull up the chart of Logic. I'm sure any of you who know astrology, you see this chart and immediately think, whoa, what a super powerful chart. This chart is filled with power, it's filled with authority and resiliency. This chart is highly, highly resilient, and we're going to get into why I'm saying what I'm saying. But the issues that I have at hand that I really want to touch on in the astrology, because again, this is the purpose of the video, is the issues with the father. I want to look at issues with the mother. Of course, I want to look at mental health. We're going to look at the early neglect and the results of the early neglect, such as feeling isolated, feeling depressed, feeling anxiety, having high-risk behavior. We're going to look at some of the outcomes of that and how he's used these early experiences that were not so positive and how he turned them into more positive attributes in himself, which are so profoundly powerful. This is a really strong person. So when we're looking at Logic's chart, of course we see that he is a Capricorn ascendant. Of course he's a Capricorn ascendant. If you listen to any of his music, he talks about being disciplined, being hardworking, being steadfast, showing up on time, and not being like his father. It's super interesting. There are some lyrics in his music where he talks about wanting to show up for his children, not wanting to blow a whole lot of money, not being like the father that he had, essentially. And what's so profoundly interesting about that is he has been so impacted by his father in the respect that he doesn't want to be anything like his father. Does that make sense? So he doesn't want to be like his father so much that kind of disdain had a profound effect on the characteristics that he developed growing up, again, which we are definitely going to get into when we're talking about his father and this connection with the father. So fascinating. So again, he is a Capricorn ascendant, and his ascendant degrees are within the nakshatra of Shravana, and Shravana is the ear. It can hear the unheard. We see a lot of musicians with this connection to Shravana and having a lot of plans in Shravana, or a lot of energy happening in this nakshatra. We do see that his Lagna is here and his Rahu is here, his forward moving karma. Super karmic for him to be attracted to music and anything like with a beat and a sound. The fifth house ruler is in the first. Of course, when the fifth house ruler is in the first house, this is taking the house of creativity and expression and bringing it into the first. He's going to need to express himself. He's going to have an artistic and creative outlet. Other things about his chart, he has Pluto in the 10th. This is going to give him an incredibly powerful career and giving him a powerful stance and an authority in his career. And of course, it's aspecting the 4th, which you and I are going to talk about. So let's go ahead and dive in. Some of what we were talking about was this influence of the father. And again, his identity, how he sees himself, is largely shaped by his desire not to be like his father. It's interesting that we see the sun in the ascendant. When the sun is on the first house, this can show an individual who is heavily influenced from the father, walking in the father's footsteps, using the father as a role model if the sun is well aspected. When the sun is having trouble, if the sun is mildly afflicted, this can show someone who maybe was influenced by their father in a less positive way. Another thing I want to say is that his sun and Rahu are conjoined. It's not super close in degrees, but they're still conjoined. When the sun and Rahu are conjoined, this can automatically bring some issues with the father. It can bring a powerful father, possibly. But again, more often than not, I see it bring some issues with the father, maybe some power struggles with the father. The sun is the father and authority. Rahu also loves power and authority, okay? So when these two come together, it can create someone who is incredibly powerful and has a lot of authority, but that power and authority can hurt the relationship with the father. What I want to point out is that the sun is the 8th house ruler. The 8th house is a dastana house. It creates ups and downs. It creates losses. 8th house ruler is in the first. It's the sun, which represents the father. Okay, and this is what I think is so interesting, because the 8th house is also the house of control. It's a house that can represent charisma, but it is, of course, this dastana house. And so the way I see it influencing him is, first of all, there are ups and downs with the father. There can be losses with the father. There are going to be power struggles with the father. And because there's that 8th house energy of loss and ups and downs, I think it can certainly create an element in him that may struggle with abandonment issues. It may bring some insecurity on the inside that maybe we don't see so often, okay? Again, I can't confirm this. I don't know him personally, but it is certainly something that could be prevalent in his life. The sun is in the nakshatra of Uttara Ashada, which is the nakshatra of victory, of triumph, of overcoming obstacles. It's connected to Lord Ganesh, which is the remover of obstacles. So with his sun being in Uttara Ashada, it's giving him this ability and this willpower to overcome his opposition and to overcome his struggles. Again, it's a really powerful placement to have the sun, especially being with Rahu. Just his chart in totality, I mean, this guy, he's not going to put up with obstacles. He's not going to put up with opposition. He is going to really work to overcome these things, which again is so evident in his music and in his life. This is someone who was born in poverty, not having necessarily a leg up in society, and he still managed to make a really good life for himself. So looking at the relationship with the mother, again, when we're looking at someone's mentality or mental state, we want to look at the moon and we want to look at the 4th house. These two things are also what we look to when we are assessing the mother, which is super interesting. As I mentioned in my previous video, our inner fortitude, our ability to feel happiness inside, our ability to give and receive love, all of the heart-centered type of emotions, the tone is usually set from our early caregivers, which is typically our mother. So those two things are highly intertwined, which I think is so fascinating. And so for logic, first of all, his moon is debilitated. His moon is debilitated. It's in the sign of Scorpio, but it's also in the 11th house. So for him as an individual, I see him maybe not engaging so much with the touchy-feely emotions, okay? I don't think he learned how to do that growing up. As we mentioned, there was a lot of neglect. I don't think that he learned how to have the touchy-feely emotions. I think he's going to struggle with that. Being a Capricorn ascendant, having a debilitated moon, I think he's going to be much more practical and rational. So he has the emotions and they're in there, but the way he expresses them is probably going to be much more rational and intellectual. His moon is in the 11th house, so any struggles that he experienced emotionally or mentally will likely get better as time goes on. For the mother, what I want to point out is that when there are planets in the 11th house in general, this is 8th from the 4th. So you want to assess those planets carefully, because when planets are 8th from the 4th, this can bring loss, this can bring issues with the mother. So his moon is debilitated 8 from the 4th. Likely issues with the mother, separation from the mother. His mother could have had mental issues, psychological issues. Absolutely. So we're already seeing that there could have been these mental issues with the mom, substance abuse with the mom, separation from the mom. And when there is that separation and that lack of nourishment and connection from the mother, there can certainly be a tendency not to be super ooey gooey with your feelings. It's a coping strategy. It's a profoundly evolved strategy to keep those emotions hidden, to keep those emotions inside. If you're not used to being able to express them and have those feelings greeted with warmth and appreciation and empathy, why would you express them? Okay, so this is something that he's probably going to have to learn over time, is how to express more of his emotions. Looking at the fourth house ruler is Mars, because we see that Aries is in the fourth house. The fourth house ruler moves into the 12th. Again, this isn't a great sign that the relationship with the mother is going to be good. Okay, fourth house ruler is in the 12th. This can be a loss from the mother or separation from the mother. Of course, Mars is also Gandanta. It's in those first degrees of a fire sign. So Mars is struggling a little bit in that Gandanta zone. Okay, it's not horribly afflicted, but it has that little bit of trouble. And when the fourth house ruler is in the 12th, again, it can create a distance from the mother, a disconnect from the mother. You're not going to be likely, with this chart at least, he's not going to feel that strong connection to her, or that she's super close. It's going to feel like there's a distance. It's going to feel like there's a disconnect. And again, if a child is raised in an environment with a mother who is disconnected, maybe has some psychological issues, is using drugs, you are going to feel, the individual is going to feel that they need to isolate, that they need to take steps back. They're going to turn inwards into their own inner world. A lot of the time when children experience a lot of neglect, they spend a lot of time in their mind. They internalize a lot. They retreat inward. This is what the 12th house is all about. Logic's first house ruler is in the 12th. So this is going to show someone who needs a lot of time by themselves, who needs a lot of time to reflect, who needs a lot of time to turn inward. Another thing is that when the first house ruler is in the 12th, this can show someone who sometimes feels isolated, who sometimes feels lonely, like no one understands them. Again, it's possible that that is because he had those early childhood experiences that left him feeling lonely, okay? What I will also say is that the 12th house is the house of out-of-the-box ideas, out-of-the-box thinking. So though it may have created a loneliness, it may have created an isolated feeling, this is also giving him tons of his creativity. So much of this ability to tap into his subconscious mind and think of things on the spot and write in a really eloquent, creative, amazing way, which of course he does. I mean, his first and his second house ruler are both in the 12th. When the second house ruler is in the 12th, this can create someone who is highly charitable and very giving. Second house ruler is the house of finances and our day-to-day paycheck. It moves into the 12th house, the house of charity. Logic has done a lot of charity work, especially for suicide prevention and mental health awareness. Super interesting stuff. As I mentioned at the beginning, he has struggled with some addiction issues. He has struggled with high-risk behavior, suicidal ideation. But for this placement specifically, I want to note the issues with addiction. When the second house ruler is in the 12th, the second house is also our mouth, things that we put in our mouth, things that we like to consume. So that could be our food, but it could also be drugs or alcohol. When it goes into the 12th house does also have a connection to addiction. This can give us a tendency to be addicted towards substances. It's it's not inevitable, but what we want to do is turn that attention and awareness into things like meditation and transcendental experiences, trying to lean away from altering our mind in a drug way or a substance way. Another thing that I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention at the beginning is that in Logic's music, he clearly has an issue with the government. He calls the government out a lot. He calls leaders out a lot. He's also called out social workers on his song Fade Away. He talks about social workers in the system not caring about people, which I don't blame him for feeling that way. Okay, but he does have issues with the system. He has issues with the government. We can see this with the sun being in the first connected to the 8th like this, because the sun is also going to be connected to the government and to authority. The 10th house is also going to be the government and authority. We see the 10th house ruler is in the first. It's retrograde, it's combust. It is going to give him some issues with the government and disdain for the government more than likely. The final thing I'll say about Logic's chart is that if you've studied attachment theory at all, we know that if there was an insecure attachment growing up, it's likely to inhibit our relationships later on. When we're looking at his chart, we see that K2 is in the 7th. The 7th house ruler is debilitated. And Venus, which is the karka for female relationships, is retrograde, it is combust. It's not horribly afflicted, but it's got a little bit of problems. These are a few indicators that would suggest some intimacy issues. But when we're looking at this chart and we see the issues with the father, we see the issues from the mother, we see the abandonment, we see the difficulties, we see the inner emotions being a little hard with the debilitated moon, okay? It's not super crazy to think that there may be some intimacy issues in other areas of his life. So something that logic may need to work with is learning how to open up to intimacy with other people, coming to find a more secure attachment style. Again, I don't have anything to base this off of for sure, but by looking at his chart, by assessing his early family life, and seeing how this is all connected, I can make the assumption that there is going to be some intimacy, karma, and some things to work out. Of course, I think it's possible for him to have a long-term, healthy, loving relationship, and I think that it is going to require a little bit extra work to work through some of that trauma that he experienced growing up. And so in conclusion to this, we saw that logic had challenges with authority, with his father, with his mother, with his siblings as well, but I wanted to keep this video relatively short and manageable. So in conclusion, we see how logic's early childhood experiences may have impacted him into his adult life. What I want to say before we close is that this person is obviously incredibly resilient. Again, I want to note the sun in Uttara Ashada in his incredibly powerful first house is going to give him a charisma and a power to really stand out and overcome his obstacles. Something that I think he will need to work on in this life is working with relationship stuff. But again, Rahu is in his first house, so a lot of his karma is to focus on himself and step into his own power and harness his own power. So it's awesome to see him making his music and finding ways to express himself in a way that is connecting and healing for many, many people. He's incredibly charitable. He's raised a lot of awareness for mental health and suicide prevention. What he did was he took the troubles from his experience, from his emotional experience growing up in a challenged life, and found a way to try to create outreach, to create support and aid for other people experiencing something similar to himself, which is absolutely beautiful, an amazing way to channel this karma. So I hope that this video was helpful. I hope that you learned something new. Again, my name is Christine Rodriguez. If you have any questions, you can email me at astrologynowpodcast@gmail.com. You can check out my website, which I'll post here. Please follow me on Instagram, astrologynow_podcast, and I will talk to you all very soon.